Okay, we're going to look at now is Eisenhower, the election, and the Eisenhower administration. Okay, um, this is Dulles, John Dulles. His brother is actually also the first civilian director of the CIA, Allen Dulles. This is a picture of Dulles, 1949. He has gone to NATO headquarters in Paris. He's gone to meet Eisenhower because they want Eisenhower to come home and run for president. If you'll remember, there hasn't been a Republican president since 1932 election. So when Eisenhower becomes president, he'll be the first Republican president in over 5 administrations at this point. What we're going to find during this period is a new kind of policy. Most historians are going to sort of try to blame it on something that emerges from the Kennedy administration, but it can clearly be seen in this administration. When Dulles is the Secretary of State under Eisenhower, his dealings with the Soviet Union are going to be what he refers to as brinkmanship. The idea that they say, "How'd it go in there, Mr. Dulles?" And he says, "I brought us to the brink of war," and then skillfully at the last minute pulled us back. This is when it begins. This idea that as two nuclear superpowers, we always have the threat of basically global destruction to fight the other with. Most people will refer to it as MAD, mutually assured destruction. That if the two of us ever get into a nuclear war, we can be assured that we have enough bombs to blow up the whole world. And so that's supposed to be the kind of idea that keeps us at peace, since both sides recognize just how serious it is. It is kind of, as we think about it today, a crazy sort of doctrine, but that's how it works. Okay, he refers to his kind of diplomacy as brinksmanship. Right, I brought us to the brink of war. During the Eisenhower administration, our view towards how we're going to deal with the communists, how we're going to think, each one of these administrations, starting with Truman, has to come to grips with how they're going to apply the doctrine of containment, which was contained in the document NSC 68. Every administration is going to operate a foreign policy based on the containment of communism. And it goes all the way back to Truman. From Truman to Eisenhower to Kennedy to Johnson to Nixon to Carter, or Nixon, Ford, Carter. I almost forgot Ford because, Ford doesn't really get elected. He's just sort of there. All the way into Ronald Reagan's administration. And it's in Ronald Reagan's administration that we finally have sort of this collapse of the communist system. So from Truman to Reagan, we've got this entire system of what we can literally call the Cold War. We've got this whole Cold War system taking place here. What we have in this sole mutually assured destruction sort of doctrine is atomic weapons provide us with what the bean counters call maximum deterrent force at a bearable cost, because it takes a whole lot less money to create a bunch of atomic bombs than it does to constantly outfit and equip and improve conventional military forces. So part of our foreign policy, part of our deterrent effect on the rest of the world will be based on the fact that we can blow everything up. We can blow everything up. The brink of war. Now, Eisenhower. Eisenhower is going to come back to the country. Now remember, at the end of the Truman administration, Truman's administration was being hounded by this guy, Joseph McCarthy, and being accused of being weak on communism. When Douglas MacArthur is relieved from duty, in Korea. And he comes home. He presents a case before the House and the Senate in that joint meeting of the two bodies. The speech that Truman's policies in Korea were what lost Korea to us. Okay, so both of these guys, McCarthy is a Republican, and so Eisenhower is running as a Republican. Eisenhower is going to select the guy who used to work closely with McCarthy, Richard Nixon, as his running mate, as his vice presidential candidate. This gives Eisenhower basically all the credibility that Nixon has as an anti-communist, brings it on board for his political campaign, when in reality Eisenhower is probably far more moderate than these ideas. Eisenhower has worked with Stalin and Soviet counterparts in planning the D-Day invasion. So, when the election comes down, Eisenhower has this problem. McCarthy is starting to look like a witch hunter. McCarthy is starting to look kind of reckless. And so Eisenhower has to find a way of distancing himself from McCarthy without looking like he is becoming soft on communism. And because he can't look easy on communism, because that's what they're accusing the Truman administration of. Essentially, he's going to allow McCarthy to keep on going until McCarthy shoots himself in the foot. McCarthy's going to be the problem with his own demise. Once McCarthy starts accusing high-ranking individuals in the army of being communists, this is where McCarthy loses all credibility that he has at this point. If I can find it, I will put the Senate trial hearing where McCarthy is trying to question the lawyers for these generals, which is basically sort of the death knell for McCarthy and his communist hunting Senate hearings. Okay, Eisenhower had used McCarthy. McCarthy made Eisenhower look strong against communism, but when he doesn't join in with him, but he doesn't openly criticize him. But when McCarthy gets himself in trouble, Eisenhower lets him hang himself. Eisenhower lets him hang himself. Gives him enough rope to where he can hang himself. Now, thing about McCarthy. A lot of people, their assessment of Joseph McCarthy is that he was a megalomaniac and he was power hungry and he was narcissistic and he was all of these things, right? I question some of that. I don't think that he was self-aggrandizing and attempting to do all this stuff on his own. I believe that McCarthy was a true believer. I think that McCarthy believed that there literally was a communist behind every bush and under every rock, and that the State Department was full of Communist Party members, and they needed to be rooted out. I think he truly, truly believed it. Because after this problem with the Army, and the U.S. Senate is going to censor McCarthy, they're going to censure him on the floor of the Senate, he goes home and he loses the next election. It's bad for him. He loses the next election, and when he does, he sort of just crawls into a bottle and drinks himself to death. Had he been the megalomaniac, the narcissist who was all self-absorbed and self-imposed, he would have stood on his own as even if no one else believes me. But he didn't. He literally, I think McCarthy felt betrayed. I think McCarthy felt he had been beaten down. I think he really felt that the country no longer cared about communism, and so McCarthy is going to, well, like I said, apparently he will drink himself to death in just I don't even think it's 3 years after he's out of the Senate. So I take with a grain of salt much of the stuff I read about Joseph McCarthy. Yes, he was hard-headed and pig-headed, hard-nosed and stiff-necked, and he was constantly badgering people about communism. But I don't think it was because he was self-aggrandizing. I think he really believed it. I think he saw himself as the only one who was going to be able to save America. And when America turned its back on him, I think he folded. It killed him, essentially. Now, Eisenhower. Eisenhower is going to preside over a divided government from 1953 to 1961, which means at one point he's a Republican in the White House, but at one point he'll have a Democrat majority in one house and Republican in the other house, and at the latter part, I think both houses will be controlled by the Democrats, even though the nation will still vote for him to be the president. Could be simply because Eisenhower is viewed as this war hero who accomplished D-Day and all these kinds of things. He puts the brakes on many of the New Deal programs. He doesn't stop them completely, but he does put the brakes on many of these New Deal programs. And he's going to, some of his critics are going to start referring to him as Eisenhower, because they're going to say it's the same policies that Hoover had that caused the Great Depression, even though we know it wasn't Hoover's policies that caused the Great Depression to begin with. He thinks of himself as having the middle way. He believes himself to be the moderate in this situation, okay? Most of the New Deal programs that were helpful, Eisenhower leaves them in place, not only leaves them in place, but also perpetuates them and even increases their production. Like in 1954, polio vaccines will be placed under the auspices of a new department, a new cabinet level position. The Department of Health, Education, and Welfare will be a cabinet position created in Eisenhower's administration. This is why none of you guys will remember this, but when we were in school, because we were in a public school system, the health department would come and would give all of us children in the public school system polio vaccines. So all of the vaccinations started being given at school through this Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. So Eisenhower is going to spearhead that kind of thing. But for Eisenhower, one of his most important programs, he viewed this as one of the most significant programs of his presidency, is going to be a little thing called the Interstate Highway and Defense Act of 1956. The Interstate Highway and Defense Act of 1956. Now, Eisenhower had spearheaded this plan to invade Europe, to liberate France and to drive the Germans back into submission. When Eisenhower gets to Germany, he sees something that Adolf Hitler had done in Germany to make it easier for him to move his troops from one side of Germany to the other. It was a system, well, basically it's a German highway system called the Autobahn. Okay, the Autobahn is a series of multi-lane highways that crisscross the German countryside, right? Crisscross Germany. Hitler did this so that he could quickly move tanks and materials and men all over the country at a moment's notice. So when Eisenhower becomes president, Eisenhower attempts to start the same kind of thing, okay, with the creation of the interstate highway system. Prior to 1930s, the major highways in the country were these guys. Up here around Detroit, around these major cities, there were a few interstate highways. Along Florida, Florida had the whole coastal highway, and then the coastal highway going up California, and then the highway connecting Washington all the way down through California. That was by 1930s. By the 1970s, you're going to have this array of highway systems that crisscross the country. And look at these. These are really some of the most interesting. right through the center of the country, you've got these highways that are almost perfectly straight. They're almost perfectly straight, level, flat ground. There's no telephone poles or telephone wires or electrical power wires that are allowed to run. Any kind of power system or phone system out here in these central regions are underground, running parallel to these things. Essentially, what's going to happen is these central highways are going to serve double duty as emergency landing strips in case you have to have, in case of there is a nuclear war. It's a Cold War measure, okay? This way Eisenhower realized he could move his troops. Not only could he move the tanks and troops back and forth across the country as quickly as possible, but he could also have these sort of emergency landing strips all up and down the country wherever they were needed. They could be used. Now, this was a defense act. It was a Cold War measure. It was a measure basically to fight communism, okay? But what did it do to the country in the 1970s? What did it do to the country? It created, there's a book, it's a very interesting book. I resisted reading it because I thought of, when I saw the title of the book, I thought of it as sort of a fad, as sort of a faddish kind of text. But it was called Fast Food Nation. Fast Food Nation. See, this is the thing. Once you build all these interstate highways, and these highways are crisscrossing the country, that means everybody has the ability to get onto a highway and go from point A to point B, to go from Tennessee to Texas, right? By jumping on these major multi-lane highways. So if you're going to have people traveling across the country, what kinds of things are necessary to have also? Well, you've got to have restaurants to feed the people who are on the road. And so what you have in between the 1930s and 1970s is the rise of the restaurant chain concept. You've got, what are our chains? We've got McDonald's and Hardee's and Burger King. We got all these different restaurant chains that are nationwide, that go across the country. We've got gas stations have to pop up all over. If you've got multiple cars going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, you have to have filling stations, places. And you know, if you're going to be traveling those great distances, you're going to need hotels. Everything about this thing, even though it was a defense act, and we don't even think of the highway system today as a defense act anymore. We think of it as a commerce thing, something, because what happens also during this 1970s time period, railroads almost get driven out of business by the 18-wheeler truck culture that arises. It didn't last very long, but at one point in the 1970s, everybody was buying a CB radio so they could talk to truckers. Truck stops popping up all over the place. You even had songs, entire genre of music, which is now mostly defunct and forgotten almost entirely. But I was flipping through one of the channels on the Roku channel, and there's an old Chris Christopherson movie called Convoy that deals with this culture in the 1970s of this big rig trucking phenomenon. It almost puts trains out of business entirely. It almost puts the railroad industry out of. Now, the railroad industry has to find ways to compete, and they do. The railroad industry takes their old diesel engines and they convert them to electricity, and they replace the big engines with large diesel generators to generate electricity, and so it makes it cheaper to haul massive quantities of cargo on trains, and then the trucks to be used to distribute. So the railroads are forced to innovate in order to maintain their practice. For Eisenhower, this was one of the biggest, he thinks this is one of the most important things to happen during his administration. And I guess in reality, it kind of is, since it changes the country as significantly as it does. Because we do become the fast food nation. we become a country that is focused on getting things now, jumping in our car, hitting the drive-through, and then continuing on with our trip. We're eating up with it. Okay, so we'll let's see. So from this, what's the next thing? Now, in the midterm, in 1956, his second term in the election, he will again choose Richard Nixon, and he'll be running against Adlai Stevenson. Stevenson tried to show America why they needed him rather than Eisenhower. But to be quite frankly, most people in America liked Ike. The whole campaign button, "I like Ike," was probably the national mentality at this point. Eisenhower wins all but 7 states. The Deep South, of course, the Deep South still goes for the Democrat candidate. The election results 35.7 million to 26 million. But in the midterm elections after that, the Democrats are going to take over the House and the Senate. A 64 to 34 majority in the Senate, and 282 to 135 majority in the House of Representatives. So at this point, after this midterm election in 1958, Eisenhower will be presiding over this divided government, in which it's going to be difficult to get many things accomplished. Okay. What most historians believe is that even though the country predominantly agreed with Eisenhower's handling of politics, of the economy, his direction for the country, many of these individuals showed a desire to maintain some of those Democrat programs that were highlighted in the New Deal policies of the previous administrations. So they believed that the Congress would maintain control over those New Deal programs while they still respected the leadership of Eisenhower as he moved forward. When we come back, when we start the next video, we'll start talking about Eisenhower and his foreign policy, his dealings with the Middle East, his dealings in Cuba, his dealings with the Russians, and his dealings getting us to begin to be involved in Vietnam.